Good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 2 for PPA 500. Hope everyone's week is off to a good start. I hope you had a good first week in the program last week and everything went well for you. Tonight, we are going to be talking about American government, but before we get into that discussion, let me just first thank you for your introductory posts. I've gone through and read those, and I really do appreciate everyone sharing in the introductory forum, so thank you for that. I also want to thank everyone who is able to take the time to do the Constitution pre-assessment. That pre-assessment is anonymous, it's ungraded, but it'll be very helpful for me in order to understand in future semesters how to cover the Constitution and how much of the Constitution information we need to cover and how much we don't, depending upon your previous knowledge of the Constitution. So if you are able to do that at pre-assessment, again, I'm very grateful for that. Your first graded Canvas essay assignment is coming due next Tuesday. So next Tuesday by midnight. And for that Canvas essay, what you will be doing is responding to my prompt. And the prompt asks that you review Federalist Paper number 10, written by James Madison. And we'll talk about Federalist Paper number 10 tonight. But what Madison talks about in number 10 is he talks about the influence of factions. And he talks about some of the ways in which we can try and control factions. And he says, we can't eliminate them because whenever you have a democracy, you're going to end up with conflict. You're going to end up with conflict between factions. So if you eliminate factions, you're eliminating democracy, which we obviously do not want to do. But the second way that Madison says that we can approach the issue of factions is by trying to control their effects, by trying to balance one faction against another, to keep a singular faction from becoming too overly powerful and from essentially being tyrannical to other people and factions and other ways of thinking. So in terms of that Federalist 10, what you will do is after reading Federalist 10, after our discussion of Federalist 10 tonight, then you will be talking in your essay about whether or not you think that our current society is more or less factionalized than what we saw back in Madison's days. And then how do you think that you would best control the effects of these factions? So what types of strategies could you use or recommend using in order to control the impacts of factions? And again, tonight we'll talk about Federalist 10. And so after tonight, you'll be more than ready to then do that Canvas essay. As we had talked about last week in these Canvas essays, I'm really looking for concise, parsimonious answers. And so in terms of your initial post, your initial response to my prompt, 2 or 3 paragraphs will certainly be enough to suffice there. And then you'll respond to the posts of 2 of your classmates. And those responses to your classmates can obviously be much shorter, paragraph or so for each of those responses to a classmate. So what you'll be doing is no later than midnight next Tuesday, you'll be providing 3 posts, your initial post, which is a response to my prompt, and then responses to the posts of 2 of your classmates. It would be very helpful if you could post your initial post sometime later this week, maybe by Thursday or Friday, because it's nice if there are some posts there so that people can then respond. If everyone waits until Tuesday in order to post their initial and their 2 response posts, there's nothing for people to respond to. And so you just have a huge rush to posting on Tuesday. So if you can post your initial post sometime later this week, Thursday or Friday, I think that would be beneficial for all of us and beneficial for the discussion in that discussion forum. So that's what you have coming up due on Tuesday. I am going to go ahead and turn my camera off tonight because I want to save some bandwidth and I don't want to have any internet connectivity issues. And so usually if I turn my camera off, then I get a little bit more bandwidth and I'm a little less worried about losing my connectivity. So I think those are our housekeeping items for getting started this evening. But before we get into our agenda for tonight, let me just open it up. Do you have any questions based upon our coverage of the syllabus last week? Any questions about the course? Any general questions about the MPA program? Anything at all before we get started for this evening? As we proceed through our class tonight, whenever you would like to participate in the class, if I ask questions, you want to answer those questions, feel free to use either text chat. I have my text chat box open. I'll be monitoring that. Or you can also use your microphone. Either way you are comfortable is certainly fine with me. And what I plan on doing tonight is essentially kind of splitting the class up into two different sections. The first section of our class session tonight, we will talk about American government. We'll talk about the institutions of American government. We'll talk about where the Constitution came from. We'll talk about the idea of power and what power means in our system of American government. We'll talk about separation of powers and federalism. And then we'll pull it all together there at the end, where we will discuss what it means for public administration and why this coverage of American government is so important for our understanding of public administration. We'll then take a brief break, and then after our break, we'll turn our attention to the Constitution. And I provided a link to the Constitution for you in our Canvas site. I hope you had a chance to at least give a cursory glance at the Constitution, peruse it very quickly. In the second half of class, we will go through the Constitution. We'll go through all 7 articles and 27 amendments, again, with an eye on what it means for our understanding of public administration and why it's important for us as public administrators working in public organizations to know what the constitutional rights are of people who we deal with. We had mentioned, I think, last week, when we kind of presented some of the topics for the class, that as public administrators, we oftentimes have this thing called qualified good faith immunity, which means that we are immune from prosecution if the actions that we take are within the confines, within the parameters of our official duties, and if the actions that we are taking do not violate the constitutional rights of people that we are coming into contact with. So it's imperative as administrators to know the Constitution and understand the constitutional rights, the civil liberties that residents have, so that we do not violate those civil liberties in our dealings with the public. So second half of the class will be Constitution, first half of the class going over these principles of American government. Now, one of the things I do realize from my time as department chair is that a couple different times I did surveys of our students to see what undergraduate degrees they came into the MPA program with. And I realized relatively quickly that we had students coming in from a variety of different disciplines. And this is probably true for everyone here in this class tonight. Granted, we do have some folks coming in with political science undergraduate degrees, some people with history degrees, but we also have people coming in the program from sociology and psychology and engineering and business and English and journalism and just about any undergraduate degree you can think of works well with an MPA. And so because we have so many folks coming in with different types of educational backgrounds in terms of American government, it's important that we create kind of a common playing field for everyone so that we all have the basic same understanding of American government, so we can then talk about what it means then for public administration. And as I think I told you last week, I have a favorite answer and a favorite question. My favorite answer is, it depends. My favorite question is, so what? And so once we're done talking about American government, we will ask that question of, so what? Well, so what? What does the knowledge of American government mean for what we do as public administrators? So that's kind of our agenda for this evening. The slides that we are using tonight are available on our Canvas site. If you haven't downloaded them yet, they are available there for you to review. And as you can see, if you've looked at my slides, you know that they're kind of an outline type of an approach. And so I don't put a lot of details in the slides, but I use the slides as an outline for our agenda and the topics we cover each evening. So when we think about our system of American government, one of the basic principles of our system of American government is the limitation of power, specifically the limitation of governmental power. When you think about the framers who put our Constitution together, when they were writing this Constitution, they were dealing with a couple of different influences from the recent past. One of the major influences they were dealing with was they had just come out of this monarchy. One of the reasons for the revolution is taxation without representation, that you had this king across the ocean who was telling colonists basically what to do and how much to pay, and colonists didn't have much self-governance and self-determination. So the framers are keenly interested in creating a system whereby we could limit the power of government. And our whole system is predicated upon this idea of a social contract, a contract between the people and their government. And the British political philosopher John Locke really had a great influence on many of the framers and a good influence on many aspects of our Constitution. And if you did have an undergraduate government course, you're probably familiar with John Locke in his second treatise on government, where Locke talked about this idea of a social contract, that power comes from the people. And so if you're looking for where power begins, it begins with the people. People then decide what powers, what liberties to give to government, and then government then agrees to utilize those powers and those resources in a judicious manner to provide for the welfare of the public. That is the social contract. The social contract, obviously, is a constitution. And so everything we do in American government is predicated upon this social contract, is predicated upon this constitution. But in creating this system of government, we were very concerned about when people give power up to government, we need to have some mechanisms in order to control government, to make sure that government and elected officials and administrators in government do not abuse that power. So we need to try and limit the power of government. So the two basic pillars of our system in which we limit the power of government are separation of powers and federalism. And I'm sure you're very well familiar with both of these concepts. But separation of powers is this horizontal division or fragmentation of power across three different branches of government: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. So separation of powers is a horizontal separation or fragmentation of power between three different branches. Federalism is the vertical separation of power between different levels of government. And when we are talking about the relationship between the national government and state governments, we are talking about a term known as constitutional federalism. And it's constitutional federalism because in the US Constitution, the only two levels of government that are spoken of are the national and the state government. Local governments are not mentioned in the US Constitution. Local governments have no protection or legal standing in the US Constitution. So when we're looking at national and state governments and the relationship between those two levels, we are looking at what we call constitutional federalism. However, when we start to add local governments into the equation, and many of us work at the local government level, whenever we add local governments into our discussions, we then move from the term constitutional federalism into the term intergovernmental relations. Because again, local governments do not have standing in the US Constitution. That is something in our system of federalism that's known as Dillon's rule. As I talk about some of these things, I'll go ahead and put them in text chat for you. So I'll be typing and talking at the same time, which is sometimes a difficult thing to do. So any misspellings that I have in text chat, please do forgive those because I'm kind of multitasking. But Dillon's rule is a rule that says local governments are creatures of the state, meaning that local governments are created by the state, local governments are empowered by the state, and then, if deemed necessary by the state, local governments can also be abolished and eliminated by the state. The protections that local governments have are protections that come to them from the state constitution and from state laws, as opposed to from the national constitution. And I am old enough that when I was in graduate school, the course I took was called federalism, because that's kind of what we called those courses back then. Now those federalism courses have now become intergovernmental relations courses. And that's one of the courses I teach every summer is intergovernmental relations, because we talk about the relationship between all three levels of government. But we fragment that power across those levels of government for the purpose of trying to limit that power. We don't want too much power in the hands of one institution or in the hands of one individual in those governmental organizations. So our entire system is predicated on the limitation of power through separation of powers and federalism. We like to refer to ourselves as a democracy. But the truth is, we are both a democracy as well as a republic. And you've probably heard that very famous quote from Benjamin Franklin when he was asked, what type of a government is this? And Benjamin Franklin says, it is a republic if we can keep it. Franklin realized that our government was very much what we call a republican form of government. And when we talk about democratic and republican forms of government, we're talking about lower D and lower R. We're not talking about the political parties. But we oftentimes like to talk about ourselves as a democracy. We talk about going around the world as America and trying to promote and foster democracies around the world. There are a lot of other governments across the world that will call themselves democracies that kind of lack the primary characteristics of being a democracy. So my first question for you tonight, and again, you can use text chat, microphone, however you feel comfortable. What is a democracy? What makes a government a democracy? So what's a democracy?
Well, from what I remember, a democracy, going off of more literal democracies and not just countries that claim to be democracies, they're countries that allow their citizens to have some power, let's say, in legislation and in ruling. So that can either be, voting specifically on bills, laws, and stuff like that, or just being somewhat involved in the government and voting for representatives, kind of like a republic, like we do.
Right, exactly. That's excellent. I couldn't say it better myself. That in a democracy, we allow people, or people have the opportunity to self-govern. They have the opportunity to engage in self-determination. They can do that by voting on initiatives and referenda. And so they actually engage in making decisions. And so not all decisions are being made by representatives in DC or representatives in Sacramento. We actually actively participate in making decisions. That is the bedrock of a democracy. And the interesting thing about our system of government, and so citizens are involved in decision-making processes and they influence the government and influence governmental decisions. The thing about our system of federalism is we have 50 different states and we have tens of thousands of different local governments. That provides for a lot of variation in the way in which those entities govern themselves. And so we have different democratic elements in different states. So some states have more democratic elements than other states have. We live here in the great state of California, and California has both what's called an initiative as well as a referendum process. Initiatives allow voters, and referendum as well, but they allow voters to put issues on the ballot and then vote directly on those issues. So rather than just leaving the decisions to people in Sacramento, we as voters can force issues on the ballot and then vote directly upon those issues. The difference between an initiative and a referendum is with an initiative, it's usually a new piece of legislation, not really legislation, it's a new approach to a policy. It's not to use the word to define it, but it's a new initiative. So it's something that is new. And so what voters can do is they can circulate petitions. And if they get the requisite number of signatures on those petitions, then that issue will then be on the ballot at the next general election. And here in California, initiatives and referenda, when they are placed on the ballot by voters, are placed on the ballot of the general election. So the next upcoming general election. So whenever you want to try and get an issue placed on the ballot, you circulate petitions. And here in the state of California, the number of signatures you need on your petition will depend upon the type of initiative that it is. So if it's an initiative that is meant to change the Constitution, so it's a constitutional amendment that is being placed upon the ballot, the bar for the number of signatures you need is higher than if it's an initiative to just make a new law or to affect government code. So if you want to get an initiative on the ballot in order to amend the Constitution, you have to get enough signatures equal to 8% of the voters who voted in the last gubernatorial election. So for now, for practical purposes, that would be right now about 874,000 signatures. So people have to sign your petition and put their address on there. And then that petition will go to the Secretary of State's office. Secretary of State will then conduct a random check of those signatures. It's impossible to check all 875,000 signatures. So they'll do a random sample of signatures, determine how many of those signatures are valid, how many of those are actual people who are registered voters at the address that they have listed. And then they'll take the percentage of valid signatures from that random sample and they'll extrapolate that to all of the signatures on the petition. So if in that random sample, 80% of the signatures were valid, then if you have 800,000 signatures, then they will assume 640,000 of those 800,000 signatures are valid signatures. That's if it's a constitutional amendment. If it's not a constitutional amendment and it's just for a new law or something that will affect government code, then the bar is a little bit lower and it's only 5% of the number of voters who voted in the last gubernatorial election. So that would be somewhere around like 546,000 signatures. And then the similar process would then be used. The big difference between an initiative and a referendum, and we kind of use those terms interchangeably here in California, but the big difference is an initiative is usually for a new policy that people want to pass at the ballot box. So it's usually for something that is new. A referendum is usually to revisit an existing law. So the state legislature passed a law outlawing something, and then people get together and they get enough signatures to then vote on whether or not to keep that law. That's a referendum. So typically with a referendum, there's some legislative action first. The legislature passed the law, and now people are going to decide whether or not to keep that law or amend that law. But typically that's with a referendum. With an initiative, it's usually a new policy, something that is new to be added to the government code or something that is new to be added to the California state constitution. We are not shy here in California about amending our constitution. Our constitution here in California is perhaps the lengthiest, most detailed constitution in the entire world. Our constitution has been amended well over 500 times. Compare that to the national constitution. National constitution was amended 27 times. 10 of those 27 amendments all came all at once in the Bill of Rights. California Constitution, we've amended it over 500 times. We have over 35 articles in the Constitution. It's a very lengthy document. One of the reasons why it is so lengthy is because we have relatively permissive rules for initiatives and referenda. And so it makes it relatively easy for people to offer up constitutional amendments. But to get back to our idea of a democracy, those are all elements of a direct democracy where people directly make decisions at the ballot box. We've got a lot of those provisions here in California. Some other states don't have initiative processes, or they may not have referendum processes. But in addition to being a democracy, we are also a republic. And a Republican form of government is one in which the people elect representatives to make decisions for them. So we elect people to serve in Washington, D.C. We elect people to serve in Sacramento. We elect people to serve on the Long Beach City Council or a local school district or a regional water district. When you elect representatives, that makes for a republic. So I think the best way, or I should say the most appropriate way to term our system of government is a democratic republic, in that we have elements of both a democracy as well as a republic. So this democratic republic and the parameters of this democratic republic are established through the Constitution being this social contract between the people and their government. The social contract theory means that that constitution, both parties, just like with any other contract, are then beholden to the provisions of that constitution. And so people are beholden to the Constitution, and government officials and government institutions also have to follow that contract, that Constitution. As you probably already know, our first Constitution was the Articles of Confederation, and I provided a link in our Canvas site for you to take a quick look at the Articles of Confederation. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the Articles, but we do want to highlight some of the problems with the Articles that then led to their replacement with the Constitution that we currently have today. So the Articles of Confederation, when they were adopted, established what the Articles refer to as a firm league of friendship between the states. So it's a very loose confederation of all these sovereign states that were working together in their mutual interests. Now, it's important for us to also understand that language today is a lot different than language in the late 1700s. So what the framers referred to, and what we refer to as a confederation, the framers will probably refer to as a federation. When we think about a confederation, we think about all these individual sovereign entities that are working together, but in working together, they retain their sovereignty. And that's what the Articles of Confederation essentially said. So it's a firm league of friendship between all these different states to support each other. And one thing that's really telling in the Articles of Confederation is when you look for the term United States of America. Now, in our current Constitution, we see United States all over the place. It's dotted all over the Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, United States of America as a proper noun was used only once, and that's where the articles say the style of this confederation shall be the United States of America. By style, the framers meant the title. So what we're going to call this confederation will be the United States of America proper noun. Throughout the rest of the articles, when United States is referred to, it's not referred to as a capitalized proper noun, but rather it's referred to usually as the United States in Congress assembled. That's a very important distinction, because when you say the United States in Congress assembled, you are essentially saying that we are the United States when the states get together in this meeting, in this Congress. And the way in which Congress was being used in that context was as a meeting. And so Congress means a meeting. And so tonight we're having a Congress of PPA 500. We're having a meeting of PPA 500. So only when the states were together in this Congress, in this meeting, were we considered the United States. That's important because those delegates that were sent from the states to this meeting, to this Congress, they have the ability to leave anytime they wanted. A state could recall their delegates at any time that they wanted from this Congress. So if South Carolina didn't like what was going on in this Congress, in this meeting, they would tell their delegates to come on home and to not participate. That's a very big nod, if you will, to the sovereignty of state governments. And so state governments were certainly very much sovereign under these Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles, we had a unicameral legislature, in that we only had one House legislature, as opposed to our bicameral legislature we have today. We really didn't have an independent executive under the Articles of Confederation. So really the only real decision-making body was this meeting of all these different sovereign states together. So we didn't have a standing army. The states, when they got together in the Congress, they could regulate currency, but they really didn't. And so every state was using a different currency. And you can imagine how difficult it was to have any type of interstate commerce when every state's using its own unique currency. But one of the most glaring problems with the articles is that even when you recognize one of these fatal flaws, such as no standing army or difficulty regulating currency or no independent executive, even when you recognize that that was a fatal flaw in the articles, in order to amend the articles, you needed to have a unanimous vote of all 13 states. So every state had to agree in order to amend the articles. Well, you can just imagine how difficult that was. I mean, it's difficult to get 13 people to agree on where to go to dinner, let alone get all these states to agree to amend the Articles of Confederation. So even though it was a flawed document, it was next to impossible to try and amend. So we had these Articles of Confederation, and they were not serving us well. And one of the reasons why they were not serving us well is because, again, there was no real national defense. There was really no standing army under the Articles of Confederation. We had a situation where farmers were having their farms foreclosed upon for the non-payment of taxes. And so a lot of small farmers were losing their farms. They were losing their only source of income. So there's a lot of discontent among farmers. We saw all these different rebellions that started to pop up in the Northeast, especially of farmers complaining about losing their farms for non-payment of taxes. One of the most famous of these rebellions was Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion, if you remember from your history classes, was a rebellion of farmers that was led by a retired Army captain by the name of Daniel Shays. Now, this was just one of those rebellions that were going on all over the Northeast, but it really became the most famous one. It really became kind of the clarion call for changing the Constitution to try and create more national defense under the Articles of Confederation. So Daniel Shays leads this group of farmers in a rebellion against an armory, a state armory in Massachusetts. It took a while to put this rebellion down. It was a little messy in putting the rebellion down, but what it did is it served as what we call a triggering event that galvanized public opinion around the idea that we really need to make a change to these Articles of Confederation. If we were having so much difficulty putting down an insurrection of farmers led by a retired army captain, what would we do if a foreign nation, one of the European powers, came over and invaded us? There would be very little we could do to repel that invasion. In public policy, and you'll talk about this when you get to your 670 policy analysis course, whenever we make major changes to our public policies, those major changes usually come about because of what we refer to as a triggering event. A triggering event occurs, something happens that opens up a policy window by galvanizing public opinion around the idea we need to make a substantial change to the way in which we are dealing with this issue or dealing with this policy. In contemporary time, a good example of a triggering event was the terrorist attacks on September 11th. So the terrorist attacks on September 11th prompted us to completely revisit the way in which we are providing for Homeland Security. It led to the creation of a Department of Homeland Security, led to the creation of the TSA, led to the creation of all these limitations in terms of your freedom to travel, especially in terms of air travel, led to the Real ID Act, where the federal government required state governments to adopt uniform identification for the purposes of air travel. So you had all these monumental changes to that policy area as a result of that triggering event of September 11th. Shays' Rebellion was a triggering event that led people to think we really need to make a change in the way in which we are dealing with this issue. Go ahead, Ankit.
Sir, the formation of TSA and all of those organizations, and was it all part of the Patriot Act passed during the 9/11?
It wasn't all part of the Patriot Act. I mean, it was kind of a little bit more of an incremental type of passage that wasn't all part of the Patriot Act. But yeah, it all came as a result of trying to tighten up security as a result of the terrorist attacks on September 11th. So yeah, they were all direct results of September 11th.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and you'll see that, like I said, when you get to your policy class, it's a very, very common way in which we make policy. Typically in this country, policies kind of tend to be a little bit more incremental in that we just kind of do the same thing year after year. We might add a little bit more money each year, but we basically kind of keep the same approach year after year until there's a triggering event. And then when that triggering event happens, that's when we end up with a major change to our policies. Whenever I teach the policy class, which is kind of rare these days, when I would teach it, I would talk about an airline disaster, the value jet crash from back in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, we had this value jet that went down in the Florida Everglades and unfortunately killed all 193 people on board. The reason for that crash was that there was a fire that broke out in the cargo bay of the plane. Unfortunately, there are no smoke detectors in the cargo bay of the plane, and so the crew didn't know that there was a fire until it was too late, until the fire had already burned through the electronics and made it impossible to try and recover the jet before it crashed. So that was a triggering event, a tragic, just like 9/11, a very tragic triggering event. But as a triggering event to make us think that maybe we need to require smoke detectors in the cargo bay of all planes. That was a major change to the policy that came as a result of that value jet crash. So that's oftentimes how we make major changes to policies. And so Shays Rebellion was kind of that triggering event that then led to the Constitutional Convention. Now, at the Constitutional Convention, the primary goal of the Constitutional Convention was not to replace the Articles of Confederation. The primary goal was to amend the Articles to essentially create for more national defense, to strengthen the national government in terms of providing national defense. It was a very limited type of purpose at that Constitutional Convention. However, the way in which the convention played out resulted in a brand new constitution. And the reason for that, and one of the major reasons for that, is when you look at when the delegates arrived at the Constitutional Convention, the delegates that typically arrived first at the Constitutional Convention were what we refer to as the Federalists. There were people at that time, people like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and people who believed in a stronger national government for more reasons than just national defense. You know, Hamilton wanted to see a national government that had ability to regulate commerce and regulate the economy, much more so than we ever would have thought of back in the Articles of Confederation. So it's kind of a practical issue that once you get all these people advocating for a national government that arrived first at the convention, they were able to get the ball rolling toward replacing the Articles with a brand new constitution. So that when the anti-federalists, people like Sherman, those who believed in more in states' rights and state sovereignty, who only wanted to amend the Articles, by the time they got there, it was already a little bit too late because the delegates were already talking about abolishing the Articles and replacing them with a brand new constitution. The Constitution is very much a series of compromises. And by necessity, it's a series of compromises because of these three main conflicts that were going on among delegates at the Constitutional Convention. The first conflict at the Constitutional Convention between delegates was this conflict between large and small states. Large states such as Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, they wanted Congress to have proportional representation, which would give those large states more representatives in Congress than small states. Small states such as New Jersey wanted equal representation because obviously they feared if there was proportional representation, they would never get their voices heard in Congress and they would just be dominated by the larger states with more representatives. The Virginia plan called for proportional representation. The New Jersey plan called for equal representation. And the compromise that we ended up getting was what's known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. And the Connecticut Compromise, we come up with this idea of a bicameral legislature, a two-house Congress, a House of Representatives, which would be the lower house, which is based on proportional representation, and an upper house, the Senate, which is based upon equal representation. That kind of bicameral model is something that has then served as a blueprint for state legislatures around the country. And here in California, as you all know, we have a bicameral state legislature, we have a state assembly, and we have a state senate. One of the differences between our bicameral legislature and the one at the national level is size. So in the House of Representatives, currently there are 435 seats. In the US Senate, there are 100 seats. Here in California, in the Assembly, we have 80 seats, and in the state Senate, we have 40 seats. And here in California, we also have very much one party domination in our state legislature. Of those 80 seats in the state assembly, 62 of those 80 seats are held by Democrats. 18 of those seats are held by Republicans. So it's almost an 80% majority for Democrats in the state assembly. In the state Senate, of those 40 seats, 32 of those are held by Democrats, and there are only 8 Republicans in the California State Senate. So it is an 80% supermajority for Democrats. You combine that together with a Democratic governor, and we have one party control, unified government here in the state of California. But this whole idea back in the Constitutional Convention of creating these two houses of Congress, a lower house and an upper house, this was the compromise in order to mollify both the large states as well as the small states. So that's one compromise in the Constitution. A second conflict that arguably the framers were either unwilling or unable to deal with effectively was the conflict between slave states and non-slave states. As we know, slave states, primarily in the South, their economic system was predicated upon this system of slavery. And a lot of those delegates from those Southern slave states wanted to incorporate slavery as an institution within the Constitution. They want the Constitution to essentially make the institution of slavery permanent from now on in the Constitution. Fortunately, there were some representatives, more Federalist representatives from oftentimes northern states, non-slave states, who pushed back very hard on that. People like Hamilton and even Madison, who was a slave owner, also pushed back on this. And they kept the institution of slavery itself as an institution out of the Constitution. However, some of the compromises that they made in order to placate slave states obviously were morally reprehensible, and they also really paved the way to the Civil War in 1861. And a couple of those compromises, the 3/5 compromise in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, saying for representation purposes, enslaved individuals would count as 3/5 of a free person for the purposes of representation. And then the prohibition against banning the slave trade in Article 1, Section 9. In Article 1, Section 9, we have a prohibition against banning the slave trade until at least the year 1808. So essentially what happened is you had the framers kick the can down the road. And the framers say, we are not going to deal with this issue now. We are going to put it off until 1808 and let a future group of leaders, future generations deal with that issue. So whereas the framers, I think, crafted a really great compromise for the large state versus small state debate, they did just as poorly, even worse, obviously, with crafting that quote unquote solution to the slave state, non-slave state conflict. And the solutions they came up with obviously were not solutions, and they led us to the Civil War in 1861. The third conflict at the Constitutional Convention was this conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So in terms of the Federalists, those were the delegates who really wanted to see the national government be stronger and the national government do more. The Federalists wanted to see the national government be strengthened to do more than just national defense. The Anti-Federalists came into the convention saying, we only want to provide more national defense, and that's it. We don't want to see any other additional power with the national government. We are concerned that a national government, if it is too powerful, it will tread upon the sovereignty and the rights of these individual states. So you had the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. So the way in which they came up with compromises between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists is that Madison was one of the leaders of getting the Anti-Federalists to agree that they wanted more out of this new Constitution than just merely stronger national defense. When you think about the demographic profile of the delegates at this Constitutional Convention, the delegates, in order to be a delegate, they had to be white, they had to be male, and they had to be property owners. That made the majority of those delegates what we call the creditors. They were the ones who had loaned the money to make the Revolutionary War possible. So they're the ones who loaned the money to make the Revolutionary War possible. They wanted to get their debts repaid. Madison realized that, and he realized that was a nerve that he could press. And if he could get the Anti-Federalists to agree they wanted more economic regulation from the national government so they can get their debts repaid, then it was essentially game over and we would have a new constitution and the Articles of Confederation would then be dead. There's a very famous historian by the name of Charles Beard. And Charles Beard wrote a very important book that caused a lot of controversy. And the book was an economic interpretation of the Constitution. And Beard, in his economic interpretation of the Constitution, argued that the delegates, since they were creditors, their primary motivation was their own economic self-interest. So they were there to try and get their debts repaid. That type of argument obviously didn't sit well with a lot of other historians, and there's a lot of pushback on that from other historians saying that was much too pessimistic of a view of the delegates, and that the delegates, many of them, were there for more altruistic reasons than that. Where the field of history kind of came down in its thinking was, yes, there was an economic imperative, but those delegates were not just there for their own self-interest, but they were there for the economic interests of their states. So there's a little bit more of a macro level to their economic self-interest. So the Federalists wanted a much stronger national government. Federalists wanted a much more limited Anti-Federalists wanted a much more limited national government. So in order to balance this conflict, we end up with another series of compromises. In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, where we spell out the powers of Congress, we spell out what we call enumerated powers. And by enumerated, we mean we list the powers. So Congress has the ability to levy taxation and collect taxation. Congress has the power to establish post offices. Congress has the power to regulate commerce between the states. Congress has the power to establish and raise an army and to establish and provide for a navy. Congress has the power and the responsibility to promote science and to promote the arts. And so you've got to declare wars. You've got all these enumerated, all these specifically listed powers. Whenever you specifically list powers, you are by definition limiting the power of that body. Now, I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but whenever you list these powers, the assumption is then if a power is not listed, then that is a power that does not belong to that institution. So if those powers are not listed in Article 1, Section 8, the assumption is those powers will probably then belong to states. So by enumerating those powers in Article 1, Section 8, it was really a nod to the Anti-Federalists that we are limiting Congress's powers to just these enumerated, just these listed powers. However, at the end of Article 1, Section 8, we have the elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause, that Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in it by the Constitution. That necessary and proper clause means that Congress can do whatever it thinks is necessary to help it carry out all these powers that have been enumerated. When Congress over the years has tried to expand its power over state governments, the elastic clause is one of the primary tools it has used to expand its power. So on one hand, in Article 1, Section 8, you have a nod to the Anti-Federalists with enumerating powers. And on the other side, you then have a nod to the Federalists by providing this blanket elastic clause that allows Congress to do anything that it considers to be necessary and proper. So there's your one compromise right there between Federalists and Anti-Federalists in Article 1, Section 8. Another example is the Supremacy Clause. So in Article 6, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution, the Constitution says that the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. That is a very strong pronouncement of national government power. That's saying that when a state constitution or a state law comes into contact with a national constitution or a national law, the national constitution, the national law wins. That very strong proclamation of national government power was obviously something that the Federalists wanted to see in the Constitution. However, it scared the heck out of the Anti-Federalists. And for that reason, a lot of the Anti-Federalists did not support this new Constitution. And they went back home to their states and they advocated for the states to not ratify this new Constitution because it created that supremacy on the part of the national government. So, as you know from your American government courses, in order to get the Constitution ratified and to get the Anti-Federalists and citizens of New York to agree to this new Constitution, we immediately had to amend it 10 times with the Bill of Rights. And that 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights, known as the Reserve Powers Amendment, says that any powers that are not given to Congress nor denied to the states belong to the states and or the people. And so it says basically if a power is not given to Congress or given to the national government, that power then resides with state governments. And that was a reassurance that was then given to the Anti-Federalists that there would be some limitations on the power of this supreme national government. Now, it is an interesting situation that in order to get ratification, you had to have 10 amendments added to the Constitution immediately. And that's what the Bill of Rights were. It's interesting also that the Bill of Rights consists of 10 amendments, but they're actually supposed to consist of 12. There were 12 amendments that were proposed to be part of the Bill of Rights. 2 of those 12 amendments did not get enough states to ratify them to become part of the Constitution. One of those amendments that did not get enough states to ratify it was an amendment that said that Congress cannot vary its compensation. Congress cannot get an increase in its pay until it stands for re-election. So if Congress wants to increase its pay, it must then have an intervening election and get reelected, and then it can increase its pay. That was an amendment that was written by James Madison back in 1791, and it did not get enough states to ratify it until 200 years later. So that amendment actually, interestingly enough, became the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. It didn't get the requisite number of states to ratify it until 1992. We'll talk a little bit more later on as we talk about the Constitution, how that all came about and how there's an amendment ratified in 1992 that was actually written 200 years earlier by James Madison. But that was one of the original 12 that didn't get ratified at the time. Another amendment that did not get ratified as part of the Bill of Rights was an amendment that would have limited the size of House districts, just House of Representatives districts, to 50,000 residents. So the largest House district could be would be 50,000 residents. Today, House districts are about 750,000. And so you can kind of see what would have happened if this amendment would have been ratified. The size of the House of Representatives today would be about 4,326 members, as opposed to 435. Think about how hard it is in the House to get a majority of 435 folks to agree to anything, and then multiply that exponentially to trying to get a majority of 4,300 people to agree. So it's probably a good thing that that amendment did not end up getting ratified. But of the 10 amendments that did get ratified, those are your first 10 amendments to the Constitution, again, put in place to try and convince Anti-Federalists and the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution. Once the Constitution went out for ratification, it was ratified relatively quickly by 10 states. And the provision in the Constitution is that it would go into effect once it was ratified by 9 out of 13 states. It would officially go into effect. So it didn't have to be unanimous, just 9 out of 13 states. What complicated matters a little bit is that Vermont then joined the Union to make 14 states during this whole process of ratification. So it then increases the requirement to 10 out of 14 states. We still got 10 states to ratify the Constitution within the 2-year period of time, which is relatively quick. The problem, though, is that one of those 4 holdout states was the state of New York. The state of New York was the linchpin of commerce in the colonies. If you didn't have New York, you had nothing because most trade was coming in through the port of New York and then moving on to the other states. So the framers knew they had to convince New York to ratify the Constitution. So the 10 Amendments, the Bill of Rights, would help them ratify the Constitution, help their concerns over too strong of a national government. But Hamilton, Madison, and Jay realized that they really need to advocate for this new Constitution. And that's what led to the Federalist Papers. So you have 85 Federalist Papers written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 papers. James Madison wrote 29, and John Jay wrote 5. And the reason John Jay wrote 5 is he fell ill after writing 5, and he was just unable to write anymore. All these 85 Federalist Papers were all written under the pseudonym of Publius. Now, we came to know relatively quickly who wrote what because it became very clear from the writing styles who wrote which of the Federalist Papers. But those 85 Federalist Papers were written kind of as a sales pitch, if you will, to convince New York to ratify this new Constitution. So understanding that, we can kind of understand how they wrote their Federalist Papers. They were writing it as kind of a influential type of argument to influence the citizens of New York to ratify the new Constitution. I have a link on our Canvas site that will take you to all 85 of those Federalist Papers if you'd like to go and read all 85 of them. For our purposes tonight, we are going to look at 2 of them. We're going to pull out Federalist Paper number 10 and Federalist Paper number 39 as 2 of the more influential of those 85 Federalist Papers. Federalist Paper 10 and 39 were both written by James Madison. Let's start with Federalist 39 first, and then we'll talk about Federalist 10, which you'll be using as a basis for your Canvas essay. So when Madison wrote Federalist Paper number 39, what he was trying to do is he was trying to argue, especially to the citizens of New York, not to worry about this new national government, this new Constitution, because number one, the Constitution was not too unlike what we already had in a lot of our states. So he went through some examples where he would say things such as a 4-year term for a president. That's not too long of a term. Look at this state has a 4-year term. This state has a 6-year term for their governor. So a 4-year term for a chief executive is nothing that is terribly surprising. A 6-year term for a member of the Senate is also something that's not all that surprising in that some of your legislatures in your states have 6-year terms for their members. So his first argument is don't be afraid of this new Constitution because it's somewhat similar to what you already have in the constitutions in your respective state. So it's nothing that is really unusual and off the wall, so to speak. Then the second argument he uses, which I think is probably the more persuasive of the arguments, is he kind of approaches this as a social scientist. He says, let's take the Constitution and let's deconstruct the Constitution into its component elements. So I say, first off, let's look at the question of who put this Constitution together. So who created the Constitution? And he says, states created the Constitution. States predated the Constitution. States were around before this new national government was around. And the representatives, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were there as representatives of their states. So the states created the Constitution. The states essentially created this new nation. Since the states created this new nation, that part of the Constitution is what he referred to as federal in nature. And this entire argument he made is to look at the different elements of the Constitution to ask the question, is it federal or is it national? By federal, he means states retain the power. And by federal, he's kind of talking about what we would refer to as confederal today. that the states retain their power, the states retain their sovereignty. That would be what he considered to be a federal constitution. A national constitution would be a constitution where the vast majority of the power is centralized in the national government. So his goal here is to kind of show this is not a national constitution. It's really kind of a combination of the two, leaning more toward the federal as opposed to the national. So since the states put this constitution together, the states created the nation, that was federal in nature because the states used their sovereignty to create the constitution. That was a persuasive argument in Federalist 39 for the anti-federalists, but the problem was that it really then laid the seeds for the eventual succession of southern states and the lead up to the Civil War. When you look at the reason why South Carolina and other southern states seceded from the nation, is they seceded based upon the idea that the states created the nation, so therefore the states can then choose to leave it if they want to. And that's why they argued it was legal and constitutional for them to secede from the Union. And they cited language such as what Madison wrote there in Federalist number 39. So kind of unwittingly and unintentionally, Madison, with his language, kind of laid the seeds then for the eventual secession of the southern states and the Civil War. But then he says, let's look at other aspects of the Constitution as well. So he said, let's look at the extent of power that is granted under the Constitution. So we know that the House of Representatives is popularly elected, and we have representatives who are being elected on a proportional representation basis. So that's a little bit more national in nature. The states don't really control who their public elect to the House of Representatives. However, under the Constitution, members of the Senate were not popularly elected, but rather they were selected by state legislatures. So by allowing state legislatures to select who their representatives will be in the US Senate, that is federal in nature. But how about the presidency? Well, the president is being elected not by popular vote, but being elected by the Electoral College. So the electors in this Electoral College who are coming from each individual state, they are the ones who will be selecting the president. So therefore, the Electoral College and the selection of the president is more federal than it is national in nature. So in terms of the extent of power, it's kind of a mixed bag between the two, but leading a little bit more to the federal than the national. He then says, how about the operation of government? Well, the operation of government will be handled by individual administrators, individual bureaucrats, individual officials. Since these are individual officials, they're not necessarily doing what their states tell them to do. So he kind of throws his hands up and says, okay, this is national. It's national in nature in terms of how the government will be operated. However, and he says some other points, but then he says, however, when you look at how this Constitution will be amended, it has very much of a state federal flavor to it as well. So when you amend the Constitution, constitutional amendments are proposed usually by 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. So state legislatures will get to determine what types of amendments are then added to the Constitution. So that's a very federal type of an approach. When you think about how the Constitution itself is being ratified, it's being ratified by states. So again, states then have the power over the ratification of the Constitution itself. So he basically says when you add it all together, the Constitution is neither wholly federal nor wholly national. It is a combination of federal and national, and actually, with his argument, kind of leans a little bit more to the federal than the national. So again, that was all written for the purpose of trying to convince people in New York and anti-federalists specifically to support and ratify this new Constitution. Federalist Paper number 10 is another very important Federalist paper. It's probably one of the top 5 Federalist papers out of the 85 in terms of being cited. But in Federalist Paper number 10, Madison lays out for us his idea of what our republic should look like. Now, the prevailing thought at the time is that the best way to organize a government is through what's known as a compact republic. So political philosophers such as Montesquieu and others believed that we needed a compact republic in which you would have a small jurisdiction, a small governing area that'll be populated by relatively homogeneous residents. So people who shared much of the same opinion, people who shared much of the same values. And the more homogeneous and the smaller the republic, the easier it was to govern that republic. And that was this compact republic type of theory. Madison takes this thought and turns it on its head and says, no, the best way or the most appropriate way to organize a government is with what he called a compound republic. And in that compound republic, you would have a large jurisdiction, a large area in which you would have heterogeneous types of opinions and perspectives within that jurisdiction. Whenever you have a compound republic, you're going to end up having factions. You're going to have groups that all have their own vested interests, and oftentimes those groups will come into conflict with each other. Madison believed that conflict was a natural artifact or outgrowth of a system of democracy. You're going to have this conflict between all these different heterogeneous groups. He says there are two ways you can deal with those conflicts. One way you can deal with the conflicts is by eliminating factions. So you eliminate all these different thoughts and everyone just has the same thought, the same opinion. He says that doesn't work, obviously, because if you eliminate factions, you're eliminating freedom and democracy. So that first approach is something that he throws away. He says the second approach is the one that we use in a compound republic, and that we deal with these factions by controlling their effects. So we control their effects by balancing one group against another. This is a common theme that we see coming out of the Federalist Papers, not only from Madison, but also from people like Hamilton in Federalist number 28, when he was talking about separation of powers and fragmentation of power. You balance what Hamilton said is ambition versus ambition. So if you can balance one group against another group, then you can guarantee that one group will not become overly powerful and then be tyrannical over all the other groups in your compound republic. So the best way to deal with factions is by controlling their effects, by balancing one group against another group. That makes a lot of sense, and that's an appealing type of logic if your factions have relatively equal resources and relatively equal power. Today, we oftentimes think about our factions as kind of interest groups, and interest groups as an example of factions. Different interest groups are going to have different amounts of resources. Some interest groups will base their resources upon the size of their membership. And so you think about an interest group such as the AARP, the Association for the Advancement of Retired Persons. The AARP is by far the single largest interest group by membership in the entire country. So they wield a lot of power because of the number of members that they have. The AARP can say to a member of the House of Representatives, you know, your 750,000 residents in your congressional district, 50,000 of those folks are retired and are members of the AARP. That's going to carry a lot of weight with a member of Congress who wants to get reelected to their position. Some interest groups, they wield a lot of influence based upon the types of members that they have. So you think about a group such as the American Bar Association, made up of lawyers, the American Medical Association, made up of doctors and medical professionals. The type of membership you have can also give you those types of resources, those types of influence over policy making. And then obviously money. You know, the more money that you have as an interest group, the more you can then influence elected officials through campaign donations and to then get the resulting legislation that you want to get. So I think one of the differences between today and Madisonian times is that today our interest groups, our factions are not as equal in terms of their power and resources as perhaps they were in the late 1700s. But based upon this argument that Madison gives us about creating a compound republic and then controlling the effects of factions, as you work on your Canvas essay number 1, think about the argument that Madison made, and then think about whether or not you think we are more factionalized today than we were back in Madison's times. And then what are some specific strategies that you would recommend in order to help us better control the effects of factions and to better control the possibility that one faction will become overly powerful and then dominate other interests and other factions in society. So if you could go back, if you haven't read Federalist Paper number 10 yet, go back and review Federalist Paper number 10, and then that will serve as the basis for your essay in Canvas essay number 1. But again, those are just 2 of those 85 Federalist Papers. And we should also recognize that while Hamilton and Madison and Jay were writing these Federalist Papers to advocate for the ratification of the Constitution, you then had the anti-Federalists who are writing their own set of papers as well. So there's also a set of writings called the anti-Federalist Papers. Those anti-Federalist papers don't get nearly as much publicity as the Federalist Papers because essentially to the victor go the spoils. The Federalist Papers were successful along with the Bill of Rights in convincing citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution. Eventually, all of the states ratified the Constitution, and the Federalists essentially won that argument. And so since the anti-Federalists didn't win, some of those anti-Federalist papers have kind of gone into the oblivion of history. But just to let you know that there were other papers written by anti-Federalists that were written to counter the arguments made by Hamilton, Jay, and Madison in the Federalist Papers. So that then all leads to the ratification of this Constitution, this social contract between people and their government. However, we need to take a little breather here for a second, because up to this point in time, over the past hour or so of class, we've been talking a lot about this idea of power. So we're talking about separating power between the 3 different branches of government. We've been talking about fragmenting power across the different levels of government, national, state, and local. We've been talking about people retaining power in the social contract theory. So power has come up over and over again tonight. So I think it's instructive for us to take a few minutes and really talk about this term power and what the term power really means. So my question for you is, give me a definition of power, just a basic definition of what the word power means to you. So what is power? We talk about power all the time, but we very rarely actually sit down and think about what we mean by the term power. So what's power?
The ability to make things happen.
Sure, absolutely. The ability to make things happen, the capability to make things, to make change or to have an impact. Absolutely. And I think when we're making things happen and we're making a change and having an impact, oftentimes when we exercise power, we are trying to have an impact on the decisions and the actions of someone else. So I think kind of a basic definition of power is that power is when we use resources. Yeah, exactly as it said in text chat, when we use resources in order to influence others to do something they otherwise would not do. So if you're utilizing resources to influence someone else to do something they otherwise would not do, you're oftentimes said to be exercising power. And I think that's a good basic definition of what power is, but I'd like to get a little bit more nuanced and kind of delve more into this term of power. I want to introduce you to a researcher, theorist by the name of John Gaventa. And if you have taken sociology classes in the past, you may have dealt with this idea of power and John Gaventa's writing on power. But John Gaventa really wanted to kind of delve into what really was power and why some individuals were able to exercise so much power over others, and specifically to get others to do things that are clearly not in their own rational self-interest. Because we oftentimes like to think about human beings as being rational, self-interested actors, that they will consider the benefits and the risks of a course of action, and then they'll select a course of action where the benefits exceed the risks or the costs. That's rational self-interest. But sometimes we'll see people do something that is not in their rational self-interest because they're being influenced to do it by someone else. So what Gaventa decided to do is he wanted to do some case studies. So he did a case study of a coal mining town in rural Kentucky and a case study of a coal mining town in rural Tennessee. So he went into Appalachia and he decided to look at these coal mining towns. And again, what he wanted to know is he wanted to know, why were the coal mine workers doing all these things that were clearly not in their self-interest, but were in the interest of the coal mine companies? So what he found is he goes into these coal mining towns and he found out that the coal mine workers were working very long weeks for very low pay. They're working 70, 75, 80-hour weeks. He also noticed that they were working in very dangerous mine conditions. If you know anything about coal mines have this really nasty propensity for exploding. In the process of mining, what you do is you release gases while you are doing the mining. And then if you have some type of a flame, that will then cause an ignition and will then cause an explosion. And when you have a pickaxe and you're hitting that pickaxe on rock, oftentimes you create sparks. There's any gas lingering in the mine, that spark will then cause an explosion. That's where they usually say, canary in a coal mine. So they would send a canary into the coal mine to see if there was any gas there. If the canary came back and lived, then you could go into the mine and there wasn't that much gas. But there was a process at the time, still is, but there was a process at the time that's known as mine dusting. And dusting of the mine is when you would literally go in and you would dust the mine down with powder and you would tamp down a lot of those gases so that when you don't have the gases, if you did have some ignition, it's not going to matter because there's no gas in the environment of the mine. It's a very simple process to dust mines, but it also costs money. And so it really ate away at the bottom line for a lot of these coal mine owners. So a lot of these coal mine owners were neglecting the dusting of the mines, which made them very dangerous conditions. And the coal miners knew the conditions were dangerous, but they were still going in and doing the work 75, 80 hours a week. Also, these coal miners were being paid not in cash, not in money, but they're being paid in tokens. You've always heard about the company store. Well, there is one store in each one of these towns. It was owned by the coal mine company. The only place you could redeem these tokens was in the company store. So, the old song, I owe my soul to the company store, that's getting paid in tokens and only being able to buy things through the coal mine company. So the companies were basically getting all their money coming right back to them through their company stores. So clearly the coal mine companies, the coal mine owners were exerting a lot of power, a lot of influence over these coal miners. So Gaventa wanted to know essentially why and how this was working. His studies resulted in the identification of what he called 3 faces of power. And by face of power, he basically means a type of power. So there are basically 3 types of power that he identified. The first face of power, I like to call the overt face of power, and that's the least dangerous. In overt power, both parties in the relationship know what's going on. So the one that's having power exercised over them know what's happening, and the one who's exercising power knows what's happening as well. So there's full information on both sides of the equation with this first face of power. That's what makes it the least dangerous type of power. So from our perspective in public administration, if the national government tells the state government to take a certain action under threat of civil or criminal penalties, that's overt power. They are influencing the state government to do something the state government would otherwise not do. That type of what we call a direct order mandate is a great example in public administration of this first phase of overt power. Gaventa says it's the least dangerous because, again, both parties know what's going on. The second phase of power is what he called mobilization of bias. And this is essentially what we call in policy agenda setting. So before a law can be passed, it must first make it onto the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making body. So it's got to get onto the agenda of a state legislature. Coal mine workers knew the mines were unsafe, but they didn't understand why there was no rules, there were no legislation that was being passed out of the state legislature to make the mine safer. They just knew no legislation was being passed. Well, no legislation was being passed because the coal mine companies were using their profits in order to donate to the campaigns of these members of the state legislature to influence them to keep those issues off of the formal decision-making agenda. That agenda setting, that mobilization of bias is more dangerous because, again, the coal miners didn't know why this legislation was not being passed. They did not know that that power was being exercised by the coal mine owners. But by far the most dangerous face of power is the third face, which you call co-optation. Co-optation is when you co-opt someone else's opinion with your own. You basically replace their opinion and what they think is in their self-interest with what is in your self-interest. And this is what the coal mine owners were able to do. They were able to convince the miners that working 80-hour weeks in non-dusted mines, getting paid with tokens that could only be redeemed in the company store, all of these things were actually in the miners' self-interest. And so once the miners thought that was in their self-interest, then they were willing to do that. That's kind of the ultimate exercise of power, the ability to co-opt someone else's opinion with your own opinion so that they're actually doing things that are not in their self-interest, but they believe that they are in their self-interest. I like these three faces of power. I like this typology because it really recommends to us the fact that power is a multi-dimensional topic. Sometimes we use it kind of in a monolithic way where you just say power and just leave it at that, but there are actually different types of power. Keep these three different types of power, these three different faces of power in mind as we move through our future class sessions. As we talk, and in fact, when we talk about federalism in a couple of minutes, we'll talk about the exercise of power between national, state, and local governments. And you'll see the exercise of things like overt power and mobilization of bias. It's a very common type of exercise in relationship between different governments. We see different uses of power throughout all of public administration. So in future class sessions, when we're talking about things such as, management of personnel, we're talking things such as next week, we'll talk about implementing adherence to ethics and accountability. We'll talk about exercising power. When we talk about budgeting, we'll talk about exercising power. And so it's a very common theme that we'll follow throughout all of our future class sessions. But I really do like this more nuanced approach that power is multidimensional, and you have to know what type of power you are talking about before you can study the exercise of that power. I think there is probably a good time to take a break now because our next topic, the development of federalism and talking about this fragmentation of power between national, state, and local governments and how that power fragmentation impacts public administrators, that's going to take us a few minutes to do. And so I think we're probably best off taking a break right now. And then let's come back at 5:35. And when we come back at 5:35, we will talk about federalism and how it has developed. Then I'll have a slide where we will tie all this back together to public administration, ask the question of so what and what does it mean for public administration, and then spend the rest of our class time together taking a look at the Constitution. So take a break to 5:35, come back, and we will talk about the fragmentation of power in American federalism. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are back from break. And so what I'd like to do is talk a bit about federalism. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what separation of powers is, and we'll talk a little bit more about federalism and kind of talk about the development of federalism, what that has meant for governmental power, and then the influences of the development of federalism on public administration and public administrators. So as we said at the outset of this class, the two basic pillars of our system, separation of powers and federalism, horizontal fragmentation of power, and then a vertical fragmentation of power. I think we're all aware of how different presidents at certain points in time have dominated Congress. Sometimes Congress has dominated presidents in terms of our separation of powers. And so the balance of power between the three different branches of government is certainly very much of a dynamic type of balance. Presidents such as Andrew Jackson, and we know that Andrew Jackson did a lot of deplorable things when he was president, but he is kind of an example of someone who believed that the president was the only nationally elected figure, and as such, the president should be the predominant player with most of the power in the relationship. And so Andrew Jackson oftentimes dominated Congress. Contrast Andrew Jackson to a president such as William Howard Taft. Taft really believed more in the president being a reservist, kind of taking a more reserved position to presidential power and deferring many times to Congress as well as to the Supreme Court. So we have seen kind of this ebb and flow in terms of power between the different branches and separation of powers. We have seen that same type of ebb and flow of power vertically in our system of federalism as well. Our system of federalism, as established under the Constitution, dealing with the relationship between national and state governments, has certainly changed a great deal over the past 200 years. We've gone through several different eras or several different periods of this fragmentation of power. So let's talk about how federalism has developed. We'll try and do this as quickly as we can and talk about what that then means for public administration. So from the founding of the nation up to the outbreak of the Civil War, the era of federalism that we were in is usually referred to as dual federalism. And in dual federalism, we had a situation where the national and state governments were separate. National government had its sphere of influence, had its own duties and responsibilities, and then state governments had their own sphere of influence and their own duties and responsibilities. And really, never the two shall meet. They're two separate spheres of influence. Hence the reason why it's called dual federalism. You'll see on the screen that there is a white inset box there that includes 3 different models of federalism. The first model there on the left, when you have this Venn diagram with the separation of state and national spheres of influence, that's a model of federalism known as the coordinate authority model. The coordinate authority model, the relationship is very much of an independent relationship, where the national and state governments were independent of each other. They were both sovereign entities, kind of doing their own things. In the period of dual federalism, in the lead up to the Civil War, state governments arguably had more responsibilities and had more duties than the national government. So actually the sphere of influence for state governments in the era of dual federalism would be a larger circle, and then the national sphere would be a smaller circle. However, in the lead up to the Civil War, in the 1840s and the 1850s, obviously the primary issue that was dividing the country was the institution of slavery. So slave states wanted to see slavery expanded into the new territory. Non-slave states wanted to see slavery not expanded into the new territory. And so that was your big argument. We had Kansas-Nebraska Acts and all those pieces of legislation to try and develop these compromises to try and avoid the Civil War. Southern states felt that Congress was being dominated by northern states, primarily non-slave states. And so southern states wanted to do everything in their power to try and obstruct the legislation that was coming out of Congress, because they felt that Congress was too powerful and was really doing things that were not in the best interest of southern states. That was their opinion. And so southern states, in order to try and slow down this legislation coming out of the northern dominated Congress, used a series of strategies to try and slow down this legislation. One strategy that they used, and I'll put it in text chat, is a strategy known as interposition. Interposition was a strategy where southern states would use their resources at their disposal in order to slow down the implementation of a law that they disagreed with. So Congress passes a law, South Carolina disagrees with it, so they'll use all the resources to kind of slow walk its implementation, to make it difficult to implement that policy. When interposition didn't work, they then moved to a second strategy, which is known as nullification. And in nullification, southern states would just out and out say, this piece of legislation, this law, we're declaring it null and void. We are saying that Congress does not have the constitutional or legal authority to tell us to take this action. And they would literally just declare it to be null and void and then ignore it. The next step past nullification, obviously, was secession. And so they would then secede from the Union under the argument made by Madison that the states put the Union together, the states created the Union, so therefore the states could constitutionally and legally leave the Union. And then we end up with the Civil War. from 1861 to 1865. At the end of the Civil War, with the defeat of the Confederacy, Congress then engages in the reconstruction of the southern states. And when that happens, the balance of power shifts. And so the national sphere of influence begins to grow, and the state sphere of influence begins to shrink. It is still what we would consider to be a coordinate authority model in that they were still separate, but we start to see the national government doing more and taking on more responsibilities that up to that point in time used to belong to state governments. So we think about things such as the regulation of interstate commerce. Congress really started to get very active in regulating interstate commerce. They created the Interstate Commerce Commission. They started regulating workplace safety. They started regulating food safety and food quality. They started regulating the quality and safety of pharmaceutical drugs. They really started to expand their reach into regulation of the economy. In doing so, they took a lot of those responsibilities away from state government. So it becomes very much of a competitive relationship between national and state governments. And so this second era of federalism, from the end of the Civil War up to the FDR administration and the New Deal in the 1930s, is referred to as competitive federalism. It's a competition between national and state governments. They're still coordinate authority in that they are separate, but they are now competing against each other for power. Then we have the stock market crash in the 1920s, and we have the advent of the Great Depression. In response to the Great Depression, FDR comes into the White House and brings with him his New Deal programs. Those New Deal programs were predicated on a lot of federal grants and aid that were then given to state and local governments to help those governments pull themselves out of the depths of the Great Depression. That era of federalism, because you've got a lot of cooperation through the giving of federal money to states, is oftentimes referred to as the era of cooperative federalism, running from the FDR administration, 1933, up to the Johnson administration, basically in the mid-1960s. In this cooperative era of federalism, sometimes it's referred to also as fiscal federalism, because the relationship between the different levels of government is really being dictated by federal money. The dominant theory or the dominant model of federalism in cooperative federalism is that middle one that you see in that inset box, the overlapping authority model. As you can see in that Venn diagram, there are some functions that are shared by national and state governments. Some functions are shared by national and local governments. Some functions are shared by all three levels of government. You have very much overlapping authority and overlapping functions between the three different levels of government. The three levels of government really begin to become very interdependent upon each other. And there's a lot of bargaining that then starts to happen. So rather it being a top-down, autonomous type of situation, now it becomes very much bargaining over the amount of grants and how these grants can be spent by state and local governments. That era of cooperative federalism runs to the 1960s. And in November of 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. Lyndon Baines Johnson then ascends to the presidency. When Johnson becomes president, Johnson very much believed in a centralization of decision-making. He had some very clear policy goals, his Great Society and his war on poverty. And primarily what Johnson wanted to do is he wanted to try and reduce the disparities in wealth between the wealthiest and the poorest Americans. And he wanted to try and get state and local governments to help him accomplish those goals. So the era of federalism that we usually associate with Johnson is the era known as creative federalism. And this era of creative federalism in the 1960s is represented by this third model of federalism called the inclusive authority model. You can see with this model, you have these three circles, national, state, and local. State power is subsumed within national power, and local power is subsumed within state power. So you have very much of a tall hierarchical system whereby state and local governments are now becoming dependent upon the national government. So goals and objectives are being established in Washington, D.C. Then Johnson would use specific types of grants known as categorical grants. Put that in text, yeah. If you don't ever work with categorical grants are very specific grants where the money can only be used for very specific purposes. And there are a lot of accountability requirements, so a lot of auditing requirements where the national government will make sure that state and local governments are spending the money in order to further those national goals and national objectives. So you use those very stringent categorical grants. And then you also use these things called mandates. And we had mentioned mandates a little bit earlier on in this class. A mandate is essentially an order. So the Johnson administration would order state and local governments to take certain types of actions to help fulfill the goals of the war on poverty and the Great Society. We're not going to get into a lot of discussion of these different mandates in this class. We'll talk a lot more about them if you go on and take the intergovernmental relations class as one of your electives. We spend a good bit of time talking about these different types of mandates, but just to kind of foreshadow it a little bit. One of those types of mandates is what's known as a direct order mandate. We had mentioned it earlier with our example of overt power. A direct order mandate is when the national government says, state or local government, you must take this action under the threat of civil or criminal penalty. You have to do it. We are ordering you to do it. If the national government has the constitutional power to order a state or local government to take a certain type of action, they will do that through these direct order mandates. If Congress, national government, does not have the power, constitutional power, to use a direct order mandate, they may use another type of mandate known as a crossover mandate. The crossover mandate, what Johnson would do is he would say, we want you to do this, take this action in this policy area. And if you don't do what we want you to do, we're going to take federal grant money away from you in this other related area. So the Highway Beautification Act, and the reauthorization of that in the 1960s. There's an act that dates back to 1956, but was reauthorized in the Johnson administration. And in the reauthorization, Johnson said, if you do not, for example, move your billboards a certain number of feet away from your roads, away from your highways, if you don't come into compliance with that national standard, then we're going to take highway money away from you and you'll lose that federal highway funding. And just really quickly, another example of some of these mandates we see in terms of environmental protection, a type of mandate known as partial preemption. In the Johnson administration, we had the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. We were really trying at the national level to impose national minimum standards on the quality of air and the quality of water, and then needed to try and get state and local governments to come into compliance with those national standards. One way you can do it is through partial preemption. In partial preemption, the national government will say, here is the national minimum standard. State governments, your law must be at least as strict as the national minimum standard. If you want, you can go above the national minimum standard. You can be stricter if you would like, but you cannot have a state law that does not at least meet the national minimum standard. And here you can again see the centralization, kind of the autonomy, the authoritative top-down type of an approach to our system of the balance of power between the different levels of government. The era is referred to as creative federalism because Johnson was creative in his choice of tools to use in order to get state and local governments to accomplish his goals. Sometimes he would use categorical grants, sometimes he'd use direct order mandates, sometimes he'd use partial preemption, use a lot of different creative tools in order to accomplish his goals. Then we have the Nixon administration, and we have Nixon come into the White House in 1969. When Nixon comes into the White House, he brings in his own approach to federalism, which completely is the inverse of the Johnson approach. Nixon believed that state and local governments should be making the decisions, that goals and objectives should be established at the state and local level. Nixon made the argument that who knows what's in the best interest of residents than the government that is located closest in proximity to those residents. So what Nixon tried to do is he tried to provide state and local governments with very broad, very general grants of money. and it was something that was referred to as general revenue sharing. And general revenue sharing was just what it sounded like. In general revenue sharing, the federal government would literally turn over a percentage of federal income tax revenue back to state governments and allow those states to use that money in any way and however they saw fit. That provided a lot of flexibility and discretion to state and local governments. So it takes this centralized approach of the Johnson administration and flips it on its head and makes it much more of a decentralized, devolved type of approach to federalism. Ronald Reagan, when he comes in office in 1981, was also a big believer in Nixon's federalism, which was referred to as a new approach to federalism. Reagan, however, instead of using general revenue sharing, he relied upon what were called block grants. Block grants kind of fit in between general revenue sharing and categorical grants. General revenue sharing, you have very few strings attached. You can spend the money pretty much how you see fit. Categorical grants, you must spend the money exactly how the federal government tells you to spend the money. So they're very specific grants. Block grants are kind of in between. So with the block grant, the recipient, the state or local government, may spend that money in a variety of different ways as long as how they are spending the money helps them achieve those goals and objectives of the policy or the program. So you can think about something, for instance, like welfare reform in the 1990s. Welfare reform was based upon the idea of block grants. So instead of the assistance to families with dependent children, these very specific federal grants, we replaced those with what were called temporary assistance to needy family grants, or TANF, TANF grants. Those TANF grants were much more block in nature, whereby states could spend this welfare money in a variety of different ways as long as how they were spending the money resulted in moving people from welfare to work, which was the primary goal of welfare reform. So in the Reagan administration, much like in the Nixon administration, the balance of power really was meant to try and shift down to state and local governments and away from the national government. So where are we at today? I think with the beginning of the Clinton administration and moving through modern presidents all the way up through the Biden administration, I think our approach to federalism is much more what I call a contextual approach to federalism, whereby the balance of power between national, state, and local governments is usually dictated more by the issue than it is by political ideology. So it's really the issue itself that will determine who has the power, state, local, or national governments, in the decisions being made about the goals of the program and decisions being made about implementation of those programs as well. And again, I don't want to belabor it too much because I know we're kind of running long in the tooth right now, but one good example again is the idea of, think about the Clinton administration. We had already given the example of welfare reform. Welfare reform was very much a decentralized approach, providing more flexibility in decision-making to state and local governments. However, also in the Clinton administration tried to impose a 0.08 blood alcohol content level on every state. Blood alcohol content levels, again, are the levels we use for drunk driving to determine whether or not someone is driving impaired. Some states had a 0.08 level, some had a 0.1 level, some had a 0.12 level. Different states had different blood alcohol content levels. Clinton administration wanted to have one national 0.08 blood alcohol content level. He didn't have the constitutional ability to do that because there's nowhere in the Constitution, obviously, that talks about blood alcohol content levels. So in order to accomplish this goal, he used a crossover mandate. He said, state, if you do not adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level to match the national level, we are going to remove federal highway funds from you until you adopt that 0.08 blood alcohol content level. And was successful at getting just about every state to adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. So when it came to drunk driving laws, the Clinton administration was very much centralization. Here's the national standard. Everyone has to adopt that national standard. When it came to welfare reform, he was very much more decentralizing. Let's turn responsibilities and turn decision-making over to state and some degree local governments as well. So it really depends upon the issue. We try and figure out what the proper balance of power should be between our different levels of government. Well, the big so what question then is, well, so what does all this mean for public administration? So we have separation of powers, these three different branches of government. So we have three different levels of government. What does that mean for us? What it means for us is that as public administrators, we serve what's called many masters. It's the many masters theory of public administration. We are influenced by laws that are passed by Congress. We are influenced by the way in which those laws are being executed by the executive branch. We're influenced by the types of appointments that are made by the executive branch to our federal agencies. We as civil servants, we make up the vast majority of people who work for the federal bureaucracy. But as you know, the very top cadre, the very top level of leaders in our administrative agencies, those are political appointees appointed by the president. So who the president appoints will have a big impact upon how those organizations are run. The courts have a big impact upon us as administrators as well. Whenever the courts issue consent decrees or issue what are called writs of mandamus, and a writ of mandamus is essentially an order telling a government official that they have to take a certain type of action, the more of those writs we see, the more consent decrees we see, the more structural remedies we see, the more influence the courts will have on what we do as public administrators. So we've got those many masters in terms of separation of powers, and obviously we have many masters in terms of federalism as well. But working at the local level, we are then held accountable for abiding by state laws and state regulations. We're also held accountable to abide by national laws and national regulations as well. So when you've got all these different masters, if you will, that you're serving horizontally through separation of powers and vertically through our system of federalism, it means there can be the potential for a lot of conflicting direction. The legislature may tell you to do one thing, the chief executive tells you to do something else, the courts tell you to do a third thing. The national government tells you one thing, state governments tell you to do something else. So you've got a lot of conflicting direction. You have to try and sort out what all these orders and what all these laws and regulations mean. It also creates a very complex network of both cooperation and competition. We know that a lot of governance today is done through the use of networks. So whereas in the past you had a program that was then being implemented by a singular organization, a singular agency, now agencies partner with other agencies at the local level, sometimes agencies at the state and the national level. Sometimes agencies will partner with nonprofit organizations. Sometimes we'll have public-private partnerships where we'll partner with corporations in the private sector. So there's really all these complex networks that have really been generated out of our system of fragmentation of power that really has an impact upon what we do and how we do it as public administrators. Sometimes those networks lead to cooperation and some very healthy cooperation between different organizations. Sometimes they lead to unhealthy competition. In essence, what separation of powers and federalism do for us in public administration is they create the environment in which we operate as public administrators. Our environment is a far more political environment than the environment that you see in the private sector. And in a couple of weeks, in week 4, when we talk about differences between public and private organizations, that's going to be one of the major differences, is that the environment is much different between public and private. The environment in the public sector tends to be a lot more complex. There are a lot more moving parts and tends to be influenced a lot more by politics, elected officials, and political parties. There is a very famous public administration theorist by the name of John Gauss. Let me put that in text, Jeff, for you. Yeah, I've got it on the screen as well. But John Gauss makes this argument that the ecology of public administration, the environment of public administration, means that if you want to understand what a public organization does and why it's doing it, you must first understand the environment in which that organization operates. So it's kind of similar to if you want to know why a plant is growing the way in which it's growing, you have to understand its environment, the amount of sunlight it gets, the amount of fertilizer it gets, the amount of water it gets. All those things will contribute to the growth of that plant. Well, the same thing with public organizations. The environment, all those different elements of the environment will have an impact upon how that organization grows and the types of decisions and behaviors that that organization engages in. And for us in public administration here in the United States, our environment is a very political one with the separation of powers as well as with federalism. So essentially, what it means for us as public administrators, if you want to boil it down to one point, it means complexity, a much more complex environment. And as we proceed throughout the class, we will talk about that complex environment, and we will talk about what the environment means for how we run our organizations, what the environment means for how we abide by accountability and ethical standards, what the environment means for how we manage human resources, what it means for how we manage financial resources, what it means for how we implement policies and programs. And really, this environmental approach is something that's going to touch upon every single topic that we cover throughout the course. So, that being said, what we have essentially done is we've kind of created this common understanding, this common baseline for understanding how our system of American government affects the field of public administration, what our organizations do, and what we do as public administrators. But as we had discussed earlier on, our system of government is very much predicated upon our Constitution. Our Constitution is our social contract. So it's important for us as public administrators to understand what the Constitution says and the types of rights and privileges that are provided to citizens within this Constitution. Now, I have provided a link to the Constitution on our site, so hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at the Constitution. This is really your only opportunity in the MPA program to really look at the Constitution. This is really our only chance to do it. And so that's why I'd like to take some time in this week's class to go through the Constitution, kind of hit the highlights in terms of what the Constitution says and what impacts it may have on what you do as a public administrator. Now, I am not going to go through every single aspect of the Constitution. We just don't have the time to do that. I just kind of want to hit some of the highlights of what is said in different segments of the Constitution, and then again, what that then means for us as public administrators. So, if you haven't looked at the Constitution in a while, the Constitution is a very well organized document. It consists of 7 articles. Each article deals with different topics. And then it has those 27 amendments, those 27 changes. All 10 of those all came at once in the Bill of Rights, but 27 amendments to the Constitution. Most of those amendments to the Constitution are amendments that clarified or expanded the rights and liberties of citizens. And so those amendments become very important for us to know and understand in dealing with our citizens. So Article 1 talks about Congress. Article 1 is by far the most detailed and the lengthiest article in the Constitution. Some political scientists will argue that because Congress is discussed first in the Constitution, Article 1, that makes Congress the quote-unquote first branch of government. And so some political scientists will argue this is justification for why Congress should have the most power in comparison to the other 2 branches of government. I think presidential scholars will probably disagree with that. Judicial scholars may disagree with that as well. But Congress is the first institution that's discussed by the framers. Article 1, Section 1 establishes this bicameral legislature. So we will have a House of Representatives and we will have a Senate. As we know, the House of Representatives is based upon proportional representation. House of Representatives members will be elected every 2 years. In order to be a member of the House of Representatives, you need to be at least 25 years old. You need to be a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years. And you also need to be an inhabitant of the state that you are elected from. So very clearly in Section 2, we have some specific requirements for people to serve in the House of Representatives. You'll see there on section 2 of Article 1, that third paragraph, you'll see brackets around it. Those brackets essentially mean that it has been changed. So that language has been changed with ensuing amendments. And so in those brackets, you had a provision known as the apportionment clause. The apportionment clause says that representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned essentially according to population of the state. This precluded the use of a direct federal income tax. So someone tells you that the federal income tax is unconstitutional. They were right previous to 1913 and the adoption of the 16th Amendment. Now they are wrong because the 16th Amendment provided Congress the ability to levy taxation on any source whatsoever. So it removed this apportionment clause. The 3/5 compromise was also involved here in this bracketed section of these section 2 of Article 1. And fortunately, that has also been removed from the Constitution with ensuing amendments. Again, we're going to go through this relatively quickly, but the House of Representatives also in Article 1, Section 2 is charged with establishing offices, and the one office that is mentioned in the Constitution is Speaker of the House. So there is one constitutional office in the House of Representatives. It is Speaker of the House. Mike Johnson is the current Speaker of the House from the state of Louisiana. If you watch Congress operate over the past several months, you know that the House had a lot of difficulty coming to agreement on a speaker. That speaker is then second in line to the presidency behind the vice president of the United States. Section 3 then turns its attention to the United States Senate. The Senate is supposed to be the upper house. So therefore, instead of 2-year terms, senators will serve 6-year terms. So you have these very long terms in office to, again, give you some insulation from political influences. The Senate is basically divided up into thirds. And so every 2 years, a third of the Senate will come up for re-election. So you don't have all 100 members coming up for re-election all at the same time. In order to be a senator, you have to be at least 30 years old. You have to be a citizen of the United States for 9 years. And you also, again, have to be an inhabitant of the state in which you are chosen from. We know the vice president of the United States serves as the president of the Senate. The vice president of the United States only votes in the case of a tie. And Vice President Kamala Harris actually set a record in this past session of Congress that she broke more ties than any other vice president in history. And so the Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, actually gave her a little trophy to commemorate the fact that she broke more ties than any other vice president. And that just kind of underscores the very partisan, divided nature of the US Senate when you have 51 senators who vote primarily Democratic, 49 that vote primarily Republican. Some of those Democratic members, some of those members that vote Democratic are actually not Democrats. They're actually independents. People like Angus King from the state of Maine, Bernie Sanders from the state of Vermont, Kristen Sinema from the state of Arizona. They're actually independents, but typically tend to vote with the Democratic members. So it's a very divided Senate in terms of party affiliation. The constitutional position in the Senate spoken of here in Article 1 is the position of President pro tempore, sometimes just referred to as President pro tem. The President pro tem of the Senate is usually the longest serving member from the majority party. And so Patty Murray is currently serving as the President pro tem of the Senate. In terms of impeachments, the way in which impeachment works, the House of Representatives passes articles of impeachment. It's basically an indictment. Those articles then go to the Senate, and the Senate then holds a trial. That trial, when it is held, is presided over by the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And in order to convict someone of impeachment, you have to have 2/3 of senators agree and vote to convict that person before they will be convicted and then removed from office. Former President Trump was impeached twice and then was not removed from office in both of his trials in the Senate. Bill Clinton was impeached when he was president, again, was not removed from office during his trial in the Senate. The other president who was impeached was Andrew Johnson back in the 1860s. Andrew Johnson survived removal from office by 1 vote in his trial in the Senate. And there was a senator who actually switched sides at the last minute that kept Andrew Johnson in office. A lot of other things, such as emoluments clauses for members of the House and the Senate, but we will don't have time to really get into all of that. Section 4 is important because there's been some conversation about the role of state governments in elections. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. So states have control over their elections. That's one of the powers of state governments. However, Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, with the exception of the place of choosing senators. So the Congress can come in and can actually undo some of those laws that were passed by the state legislature. Let's see, we don't need to do any of that probably. Members of Congress get compensation, but members of Congress cannot get extra money for their service, so they cannot get these things called emoluments. Those are limited from members of Congress. Each House of Congress maintains its own journal, which becomes the congressional record. And so you can read all the things that happen in the House and the Senate on a daily basis. Section 7 is important because Section 7 tells us that any legislation that raises revenue, so any legislation that increases taxes, must begin in the House of Representatives. And again, that's done because the House is closer to the people, so people have an easier time of holding their representatives accountable if those representatives then raise their taxes. Also in Section 7, we have detailed how a bill becomes a law. And so before legislation can go to the president, it must first be passed in identical form by both the House and the Senate. Usually bills are not in the same form once they're passed by the House and the Senate. So therefore we go to conference committees hammer out the details. Then that version goes back to the House and the Senate, pass an identical version. Then it can go to the president for the president's signature or perhaps even the president's veto. Section 8, as we have mentioned before, is the big one here in Article 1 because it lays out for us the enumerated powers of Congress, the power to levy taxation, borrow money, regulate commerce, establish rules of naturalization, to coin money, provide for punishment and counterfeiting, to establish post offices, to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, which means to create every single federal court underneath the Supreme Court. Article 3 only creates the Supreme Court. All other federal courts are created by Congress in the Judiciary Acts. Define and punish piracies, to declare war. Only Congress may declare war. Presidents have to go before a joint session of Congress if they want a declaration of war. To raise and support armies, to provide and maintain navies, calling forth militias. All these are these enumerated powers that Congress has. Control over the District of Columbia is also one of those enumerated powers of Congress. Then, as we mentioned, there's this elastic clause to make all laws which will be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. That is a very big catch-all clause that Congress has used to expand its power. So whenever we see Congress expanding its power, it's usually doing it on the basis of one of two things. Either this elastic clause or the commerce clause, that enumerated power that Congress may regulate commerce between the states. Those are the two bases for the expansion of congressional power over state governments. Article 1, Section 9 has that prohibition against banning the slave trade. In Section 9, we're basically saying what Congress cannot do. So it could not ban the slave trade until at least 1808. It couldn't suspend the privilege of right of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, as you know, probably is to literally present the body. So if someone is arrested, you can't hide them away. You have to say where they are and what they are charged with. No bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is basically finding someone guilty without virtue of a trial. No ex post facto laws, which are after the fact laws. And so if you do something that is legal today, then Congress passes a law to make it illegal, and then you get prosecuted for doing what you did when the law was not in place, when what you did was legal. That's an ex post facto law. They cannot apply in retrospect. And there are a lot of other things here too. But another very important one for you is down here, this second paragraph from the bottom. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. The appropriation is basically saying how the money is going to be spent before you spend it. So in the federal budget process, we have this very lengthy and detailed appropriations process. When Congress is unable to pass appropriation bills and get a budget done on time, then there's always the potential for a government shutdown, like kind of what we're looking at again now in Congress. Government shutdowns obviously have big impacts upon public administrators. They mean that federal employees are being furloughed. They oftentimes also mean that the money that is being transferred from the federal government to state and local government for the implementation of programs, that money oftentimes will stop. When that money stops, state and local administrators who are in charge of implementing those programs stop working as well. So appropriation is a very important thing for public administrators. Obviously, no titles of nobility, so you can't be a sir or a knight. Then in Article 1, Section 10, we have the similar thing only for state governments. So states may not enter into treaties. Only the president may enter into a treaty, and that treaty is then subject to the advice and consent of the Senate. States may not enter into treaties. States may not do bills of attainder. States may not pass ex post facto laws. So a lot of the same limitations on Congress, those limitations are also applied to state governments as well. So Article 1, Section 10 places limitations upon what states cannot do. So Article 1 is a very lengthy, very specific discussion of the powers of Congress, the structure of Congress, and then some of the limitations placed upon Congress and the states. Article 2 then focuses on the executive branch and spends a lot of time talking about the president. The president serves 4-year terms. In order to be president, you have to be at least 35 years old, and you must be a natural born citizen. So you must be born in the United States and be at least 35 years old. We then established this electoral college, and you probably all know how the electoral college works, but very quickly, the way in which the electoral college works today, there are 538 votes in the electoral college. In order to get elected president, you need to win a majority of that, which would be 270 votes. Once a candidate gets 270 electoral votes, they are then the president-elect. They are then elected to the presidency. There have been times, obviously, in our past, very recent past, where the popular vote, the winner of the popular vote, has not matched the winner of the electoral vote. We saw that in 2016 with the Clinton-Trump administration. Clinton won the popular vote. Trump won the electoral vote, so Trump became president. We saw that as well in 2000, where Gore won the popular vote, Bush won the electoral vote, and Bush then became president. So sometimes there is this disconnect. The Electoral College was established to try and provide some protection to state governments so that small states would at least have some representation in terms of the number of electors that they have casting votes for the president. Each state has a number of electors equal to the number of representatives they have in the House, plus the number of 2 senators that they have in the Senate. So you add that up, and that then gives you the electoral votes for that state. Presidents are subject to the emoluments clause, much in the same way that members of Congress are subject to it. Presidents have a very specific oath that they have to take before they assume office. In that last paragraph you see on the screen, before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath and affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm, blah, blah, blah. That oath is something that is taken very seriously. In the Obama inauguration, Chief Justice John Roberts actually screwed up the oath at the inauguration and was so worried about that he insisted that he meet with President Obama in the Oval Office later on and re-administer the oath, because that oath is something that is part of the Constitution. Then we get into some of the powers and duties of the president's commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That was important for the framers. They wanted a civilian in charge of the military. President has the ability to fill vacancies in the executive branch, which basically makes the president the chief executive. President has a requirement to take care that laws are faithfully executed, again, making the president the chief executive. Presidents can enter into treaties, which make the president the chief diplomat and the chief of state. Presidents can also recommend legislation to Congress. So technically, I think you can make the argument that presidents are also chief legislators in that they recommend legislation for Congress to consider. Then we have in Section 4 the impeachment clause. President, Vice President, all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And you probably know that we argue a lot about what the framers meant by high crimes and misdemeanors. What they meant by misdemeanors is a lot different than what a misdemeanor means to us today. But that's one of those kind of subjective discussions that happens whenever there are discussions of impeaching a president. Article 3 is then relatively brief without a lot of details. It establishes the Supreme Court. All other courts in the federal judiciary are then established by Congress. It lays out the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Cases can go to the Supreme Court through either appellate or original jurisdiction. Appellate jurisdiction is when cases are appealed up through the judiciary from one court to another. That's how 99.9999% of cases get to the Supreme Court. Original jurisdiction means a case can start at the Supreme Court level. That is extremely unusual. It would be for something that has really profound constitutional implications and something that is really very much time sensitive. Those are the types of cases that can go directly to the Supreme Court. There are no requirements to be a Supreme Court justice, so there are no age requirements, no citizenship requirements, no requirements spelled out at all to be a Supreme Court justice. The size of the court is not mentioned in Article 3 either. Currently, it's at 9. There have been a lot of discussions of increasing the size of the court to 13 or 15. Currently, the court is at 9, but that is not a constitutional provision. Important things about Article 4, Section 1, full faith and credit provision, which means that states must respect the laws of other states. They must provide full faith and credit to the laws that are passed by other states. Section 2, that citizens of each state are entitled to privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. So the rights you have in one state, privileges you have in one state should be similar to the privileges you would have in another state. New states are only admitted to the union by Congress. And so if a state wants to break itself up, like California has been talking about doing, it can only do that if it has the approval of Congress. Section 4, the United States guarantees to every state a Republican form of government. So every state must have a Republican form of government where people elect their representative to represent them. Article 5 looks at how the Constitution is amended. There are 4 ways to amend the Constitution. We have only used the first approach, which is an amendment proposed by 2/3 of the House and Senate and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. We don't really have time tonight to get into the other 3 approaches, but just know we've only used that approach, that first approach, because the other approaches incorporate a convention. And we know what happened at the last Constitutional Convention, so we're kind of afraid of going down that road again. Article 6, the important thing about Article 6 is the second paragraph we talked about before. There is your supremacy clause. The Constitution laws of the United States are the supreme law of the land. So that's the important supremacy clause. And then in Article 7 is just how the Constitution then gets ratified and how many states need to ratify the Constitution. So those are the 7 articles in the Constitution. Then, as you know, we have amended the Constitution 27 times. So let's go through those amendments very quickly, just in terms of what they mean for us as public administrators. Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, you know, is freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to peaceably assemble. There can be limitations placed upon these freedoms if the exercise has some type of negative effect upon public safety. So your ability to freely exercise your religion can be limited if the way in which you exercise it has a negative impact upon public safety. Now, your ability to believe whatever you want to believe is unfettered. That's what's called the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion. There cannot be a national religion. You are free to believe what you want to believe. Freedom of speech, again, if you are imperiling public safety, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. There are some limitations. Your right to peaceably assemble, governments can require you to get a permit just for the purpose of public safety. So that is a potential limitation on your ability to assemble. Second Amendment is our amendment about bearing arms, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We argue about this one a lot when it comes to gun control legislation. It is important to note that some people say that this is a blanket provision that everyone can own guns. Other people argue that gun ownership is predicated upon that first phrase, a well-regulated militia. We are not having that discussion here in this class, but sometimes we want to know what the framers thought. We can go to the Federalist Papers. And in the Federalist Papers, the framers kind of give us some insight into what they meant by some of the language that they use. And in the Federalist Papers, on a couple of different occasions, Alexander Hamilton defines what he meant by a well-regulated militia, talks about how often that militia needs to meet, essentially once a year, in order to be well armed and to be organized. Third Amendment is a prohibition against quartering of soldiers. This is essentially a privacy protection that you have. You don't have to quarter soldiers in your home. Fourth Amendment protects you against unwarrantable search and seizures. And so obviously this has a very profound implication for those of you who are in law enforcement. You're very familiar with the requirement to get a search warrant signed by a sitting judge. You have to have that search warrant. You cannot have an unwarrantable search and seizure. Fifth Amendment, continue with some of your criminal justice protections, indictment by a grand jury. You also then have the double jeopardy protection that you cannot be subject to the same offense to twice be put in jeopardy of life or limb. That's double jeopardy. You also then have your protection against being deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. We're going to focus on this one just for a minute. I know we're running out of time, but the double jeopardy protection, this is an important one because this really illustrates a concept that's known as incorporation that has a big impact upon us as public administrators at the state and the local level. Originally, the Supreme Court interpreted these liberties to be limitations against only the national government. So these are only limitations against national government action. Over the years, though, the Supreme Court has extended that to include limitations against state government actions as well. That process of including limitations against state government actions is the process known as incorporation. Some of these rights have been fully incorporated to include state and local governments. So something like the protection against unwarrantable search and seizure. You got a search warrant, doesn't really matter what state you're in. That's going to be a requirement, pretty much incorporated across the states. Double jeopardy is an interesting issue in terms of incorporation. There was a very famous case back in the 1930s of a gentleman named Frederick Palko, P-A-L-K-O. And Frederick Palko was tried by the state of Connecticut on a charge of murder. Palko was found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced. However, the state of Connecticut did not like the fact that it was second-degree murder. They wanted him to be convicted of first-degree murder. So the state of Connecticut retried him again. Exact same case, exact same crime, exact same details. This time with a different jury, got him convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Obviously, Mr. Palko complained and said, this is a clear violation of my Fifth Amendment right against double jeopardy. The Supreme Court in a 1937 case, Palko versus Connecticut, ruled against Mr. Palko and said that double jeopardy protection only applies to protections against the federal government, not protections against what the state of Connecticut can do. It wasn't until 31 years later, in a case called Benton versus Maryland, that the Supreme Court reversed itself and incorporated double jeopardy to include limitations against state and local governments really state governments, for trying you for the same crime twice. So it's a good example of how it took a lot of years and many decades for the Supreme Court to fully incorporate some of these rights to include protections against state governments as well. Some of these rights have never been fully incorporated. Go back to the Second Amendment. That has never been fully incorporated, which then allows state and local governments to have their own gun control laws that look different than the gun control laws in other states. Gun control laws here in California are going to look a lot different than gun control laws in the state of Texas. Sixth Amendment provides you with the right to a speedy trial, a speedy and public trial. Also provides you with the right to confront witnesses against you, provides you with the right to be informed of the nature of the crimes against you, also informs you of the right to have counsel for your defense. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, again in the 1960s, this is what gave us the Mirandizing requirement, where law enforcement officials must read you your Miranda rights when you are arrested. Seventh Amendment allows you to have a jury trial in civil cases of more than $20, so it kind of dates the Constitution a little bit. Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail, also prohibits excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishment. We argue about this all the time in terms of the death penalty and whether or not different types of the death penalty constitute cruel and unusual punishment. At some points in time, the Supreme Court has decided that capital punishment, the way in which it's being arbitrarily applied, is cruel and unusual punishment and stopped states from employing capital punishment. Then a few years later, it reversed itself and then permitted capital punishment to be used again. Ninth Amendment says enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So in other words, these rights we give to the national government, to Congress, they don't mean that the rights, all those other rights, do not belong to the people. All those other rights that are not mentioned are then retained by the people. And the similar thing in Amendment number 10, the Reserve Powers Amendment, reserving these rights to the states respectively or to the people. So if the power that's not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to the states, those powers are then reserved to the states or to the people. So those are your 10 amendments that make up the Bill of Rights. This is where a lot of our civil liberties come from, and a lot of those protections that we need to be aware of and not violate as public administrators. Quickly to finish up with amendments 11 through 27, Amendment 11 limits the judicial power of the national government. Amendment 12 stops the process of the person who came in second in the presidential election becoming vice president because of the animosity you're probably read about or seen in the musical Hamilton between Jefferson and Burr. So Jefferson championed that 12th Amendment. 13th Amendment that outlaws slavery. The 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Amendment, saying that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to jurisdictions thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So this extends your equal protection, not only against actions by the national government, but also protections against state governments, regardless of what state you reside in. There's been a lot of talk about the 14th Amendment, especially in terms of section number 3. Section number 3 is this idea of the insurrection clause, where anyone who is engaged in insurrection will be prohibited from holding an office. That's a lot of discussion that a lot of these states are having about putting together their ballots and whether or not former President Trump will be allowed to be on their ballots. We saw that in Colorado and Maine, and some other states are also coming down the pipeline with legislation and also litigation in that regard. We'll go on then to the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment says that the right to vote cannot be deprived based upon race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 16th Amendment provides us with a federal income tax. 17th Amendment provides us with the direct election of U.S. senators. Under the original Constitution, they were selected by state legislatures. Now they are directly elected by the people. 18th Amendment is prohibition of liquor. 19th Amendment is women's suffrage. The 20th Amendment changed the terms of president and members of Congress, and when they start their offices, they start in January as opposed to starting in March to try to reduce the amount of time between the election and when they assume their position. And again, we have to go through this quickly, and I apologize for that. But the 21st Amendment, which undoes prohibition, undoes the 18th Amendment. 22nd Amendment, which applies a 2-term limitation to the president. So presidents may only serve 2 terms in office. That was done in response to FDR getting elected to 4 terms as president. Then we have the 23rd Amendment. The 23rd Amendment provides for 3 electoral college votes to the District of Columbia, which is the reason why we have 538 electoral college votes instead of 535. 24th Amendment eliminates poll taxes. Poll taxes were used by especially southern states to deprive people of their right to vote. They were used for racial discrimination. So poll taxes were made unconstitutional with the 24th Amendment. 25th Amendment provides for us a process by which if the president becomes incapacitated and cannot carry out their duties as president, the vice president then has a mechanism whereby if the vice president, along with the majority of the members of the cabinet, or the vice president, along with a majority of a committee established by Congress, declares the president to be incapable or unable to carry out their duties, then the vice president would immediately assume the duties of the president until and if the president is able to contact Congress and basically provide evidence that yes, that they are ready to reassume their duties. 26th Amendment to the Constitution provides the right to vote to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And then finally, the 27th Amendment, written by James Madison, originally proposed in 1789, was finally ratified in 1992. No law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. As I said before, this was supposed to be part of the Bill of Rights. It didn't get ratified by enough states, and so it lay dormant for 200 years. A student, I believe, was in the state of Texas, wrote a paper on how this was still a viable amendment because there was no sunset clause in the amendment, and was correct. Didn't get a good grade, but was correct. And then started a national movement to then get this amendment ratified and added to the Constitution. Back when they wrote amendments back in the 1700s, they didn't put sunset clauses in there. Now, whenever amendments are proposed by Congress, there'll be a sunset clause that typically says if this amendment is not ratified by 3/4 of states within 7 years, it becomes null and void. So we probably won't have another situation like the 27th Amendment ever again. I know I went through the Constitution very, very quickly, but I'm not going through it so you will memorize it. I just think that this is our one forum in which we have the opportunity to take a look at the Constitution, understanding that as public administrators, we are held accountable for knowing and then endeavoring not to violate the constitutional rights of people that we come into contact with. You will want to maintain your qualified good faith immunity. You need to at least be somewhat knowledgeable about the constitutional rights of people you deal with, and then work very hard not to violate those constitutional rights. Now, I know I've talked a lot tonight. I apologize for that, but it's kind of the nature of the topic that we're covering in tonight's class. I'm hoping in future classes that we'll have a lot more discussion. I'll talk a whole lot less. I'm also hoping in future classes that we can start incorporating some breakout groups as well, so you can have the opportunity to work together in groups and kind of formulate your own opinions on some of these issues to then share out with the class. So don't expect every single night to be as lecture oriented as this one, and I apologize for it, but it is material that we had to cover in order to get everyone on the same foundation in terms of understanding American government and then where public administration fits within our American government institutions and culture. So that being said, in our remaining 5 minutes, are there any questions or clarifications on any of this information that we have covered tonight?
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
For the Canvas response, we have to like analyze factions back then and today. By faction, like could you give like an example or some detail on what the faction is, please?
Yeah. Today, when we think about factions, we oftentimes think about interest groups, and so interest groups that compete against each other in the policy process. Sometimes we'll think of maybe not traditional interest groups, but advocacy groups, groups that form to try and advocate for some type of policy result. That's really what we're referring to with today's factions. In Madison's time, when we're talking about factions, we're pretty much talking about things like Federalist versus anti-Federalist. Eventually, what became Federalist versus Democratic Republicans. And so what essentially became political parties back then That's what we're really referred to as factions. Today, factions are much more like interest groups and advocacy groups. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Good question. Okay, anything else? I will get this recording up onto our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning. So between now and next week, if you want to review it, you certainly can do that. Next week, again, you have your Canvas essay number 1 that's due next Tuesday by midnight. And then in class next Tuesday, we will have Kelly Janicek coming in for the first half of class, introducing you to how to do research in public administration and also how to cite sources using APA formatting. She'll do that in the first half of class. We'll then take a break. Then the second half of class, we'll talk about accountability and ethics in public administration. So that's our agenda then for next week. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you again next Tuesday. So take care.